Good morning again, everyone. My name is Brian Cook, and I'm an air pollution specialist here at CARB. Welcome to today's webinar on reporting updates and new requirements for the regulation for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from gas-insulated equipment. This regulation was formerly known as the Regulation for Reducing Sulfur Hexafluoride Emissions from Gas-Insulated Switchgear, or commonly known as the SF6 GIS Reg. I'm joined today by Mary Jane Coombs, the Chief of the Project Assessment Branch, Carrie Byland, Manager of the branch's Energy Section, and my colleague Lon Ma. Today's presentation is being recorded. Today I'll get things started with a PowerPoint presentation during which all participants will be placed on mute. At the end of our presentation, we will have a Q&A session where audience members can ask questions aloud. To ask a question, click on the raise hand icon on the GoToWebinar toolbar on your screen. Carrie will call on audience members who raise their hands, and once called upon, you will need to unmute yourself by clicking on the red microphone icon. If we're unable to respond to your question today, or if you have additional questions after the webinar, please follow up with us via email. The presentation slides have been posted on our webpage, and a video recording will be posted soon. As noted earlier, today we will be discussing the regulation for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from gas-insulated equipment. This amended regulation was approved by the Office of Administrative Law and filed with the Secretary of State on December 30th of 2021. It became effective January 1st of 2022 and supersedes the regulation for reducing SF6 emissions from gas-insulated switchgear. In this presentation, we will refer to the new version of the regulation as the amended regulation and the old version as the original regulation. Unless otherwise noted, all regulatory citations in this presentation refer to the amended regulation. Both the original and amended regulations require regulated entities, so-called GIE owners, to submit an annual report for their emissions and activities. For data year 2021, the reporting requirements are still largely guided by the original regulation, but include a few additional provisions established under the amended regulation related to early action credit and emissions limit. To reflect these changes, CARB has developed a standardized 2021 reporting form. This presentation has two parts. We will first go over the new data year 2021 reporting form, which is required to be completed and submitted by June 1st of 2022. We will then summarize new requirements taking effect in 2022 under the amended regulation. We'll start off with the overview of the new data year 2021 reporting form. The 2021 reporting form will soon be available for download either from our webpage or CalEGRIT, as shown in the screenshots here. Stakeholders will be notified when CalEGRIT is ready to accept reports. To download the reporting form from our webpage, from our homepage shown here, you will need to click on our annual reporting page, either from the left-hand navigation bar or in the feature box. Once on the annual reporting page, you will find resources such as how to create a CalEGRIT account, how to submit a report, reporting instructions, and a link to download the latest version of the reporting form. Most GIE owners use CalEGRIT, shown here, to submit their report, and these entities will be able to download the form by logging into their CalEGRIT account, selecting their facility for data year 2021, picking the SF6 GIS subpart, and clicking the download form link, shown here. As mentioned, the reporting requirements for data year 2021 are largely guided by the original regulation. There are no substantive changes to three of the worksheets: SF6 GIS equipment, SF6 transferred, and SF6 gas containers. We've pulled up the reporting form here. There are, however, some formatting changes to these first couple of tabs that haven't changed substantively. We are using a new fixed table format, so there's no longer a macro to add or delete rows. You'll just fill in your data the same way as before, and it's okay to leave blank rows at the bottom. If you do plan on copying and pasting certain data from a previous reporting form, we recommend using the paste value function to avoid conflicts with the built-in validations. This and other tips are listed on the instructions worksheet of the reporting form. The regulatory amendments required revisions to the facility overview information worksheet of the reporting form to include the calculation of an emissions limit instead of an emission rate limit and associated inputs. There is also a new but optional worksheet called Early Action Credit, in which GIE owners can report the use of non-SF6 circuit breakers. We will cover these two parts in more detail in the next few slides. Shown here is a screenshot of the facility overview information worksheet. The top part should look familiar as no changes were made. At the bottom, we added 6 data fields: average system capacity, average CO2e capacity, early action credit, EAC less than or equal to 10, emissions limit, and CO2e emissions. Five of the 6 new data fields are auto-calculated by built-in formulas. These fields are indicated by the white cells with a red border. The only new data field you will need to fill out is the average system capacity. This and other cells where data entry are required have a light green background color. You may also notice that the data year 2021 reporting form no longer has a field for the annual SF6 emission rate, and that's because we're switching the way compliance is gauged from an emission rate basis to an emissions basis, so emission rate no longer needs to be reported. Now let's go over how you'll calculate the values entered in each of these new fields. Average system capacity is calculated following the method in section 95353B, which is essentially the same as average system nameplate capacity was calculated in section 95356E of the original regulation. Calculate this value in pounds of SF6 for data year 2021. Once that's entered into the reporting form, the built-in formula will calculate your average CO2e capacity by converting the value to units of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or MTCO2e. The early action credit field will be auto-calculated after you enter data in the new early action credit worksheet. The amount of early action credit each GIE owner can receive is capped at 10% of the GIE owner's average CO2e capacity for 2021. The value of EAC less than or equal to 10 will be auto-calculated. A built-in formula will also calculate the emissions limit once the other applicable inputs are entered, which we will cover in more detail on the next slide. Finally, calculate your annual SF6 emissions in pounds as you have in the past, following section 95356D of the original regulation. Once you enter a value, a built-in formula will calculate your CO2e emissions by converting the annual SF6 emissions you entered to units of MTCO2e, so you can directly compare your emissions against your allowable emissions limit in the same unit of measure. The emissions limit is specific to each GIE owner and depends on the average CO2e capacity, the amount of early action credit accrued, and an annual emission factor, as shown in the equation on the screen. The annual emission factor, or AEF, is based on the GIE owner's average CO2e capacity. For 2021 through 2034, the AEF is 1.0 for GIE owners with an average CO2e capacity greater than or equal to 10,000 MT CO2e, and is 2.0 for GIE owners with an average CO2e capacity less than 10,000 MT CO2e. Furthermore, there is a minimum emissions limit of 50 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The early action credit provision allows GIE owners to accrue credit towards their emissions limit, as shown in the equation on the previous slide, when they activate non-SF6 circuit breakers with a voltage capacity of 72.5 kilovolts or greater between January 1st of 2021 and the phase-out date of an equivalent SF6 GIE device. Due to this provision, GIE owners who activate qualifying non-SF6 circuit breakers prior to the phase-out will see an increase in their emissions limit without an increase in the amount of SF6 in their system, improving their ability to comply. Under this voluntary provision, the amount of credit a GIE owner gets is based on the amount of applicable circuit breakers activated and the voltage capacity of each breaker. As mentioned, early action credit is capped at 10% of the GIE owner's average CO2e capacity in 2021. The amount of the credit by voltage class is shown in the table on the screen. To receive early action credit, GIE owners must report all of the data elements listed here. Serial number, equipment type, and manufacturer. Make sure all of the equipment for which you wish to receive credit are circuit breakers as defined in the reg. Also report the date each circuit breaker was activated for the first time, which must be January 1st of 2021 or later. Those activated before this date do not receive credit. Voltage capacity must also be reported. Only circuit breakers with a voltage capacity of 72.5 kV or greater are eligible for credit. The medium that provides insulating and/or interrupting function must also be reported and cannot be SF6 or oil. If your non-SF6 circuit breaker uses a covered insulating gas as defined in the regulation, report the name of the gas and its global warming potential, also known as GWP. Also indicate whether the circuit breaker was removed from regular use or transferred while in use during 2021. The definitions of removed from regular use and transferred while in use can be found in sections 95354C1 and C2 of the amended regulation. Finally, indicate whether the circuit breaker is jointly owned, and if so, enter your company's equity share and the name, ARBID, and equity share of the other co-owners. Here in a copy of the 2021 reporting form, we have filled in these data elements for two pieces of equipment on the Early Action Credit tab. We'll enter a third row right now. We'll enter a serial number, and note that once we do, the equipment type auto-populates as circuit breaker. We'll type in the name of the manufacturer and date activated. Note that if you try to type in a date that is not eligible for early action credit, you will receive an error message. The same is true for voltage capacity, which must be 72.5 kV or greater. We'll also fill in the medium that provides insulating and/or interrupting functions, covered insulating gas name, and GWP. Finally, we will use the drop-down menus to report if the device was removed from regular use or transferred while in use during the data year, and whether the device is jointly owned. Finally, since the device in this example is jointly owned, we'll fill in the required information for the other GIE owner. Now that we've entered our early action credit, we'll switch back to the facility overview worksheet to show how the form auto-calculates certain values. The early action credit is automatically filled in based on the information we just entered. That's the value of 450 you see on your screen. Also, the emissions limit is currently 50 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, the lowest possible value, because we haven't entered our average system capacity yet. Once we enter an average system capacity, both the average CO2e capacity and emissions limit will be auto-calculated. For example, if we enter 500 pounds as our average system capacity, average CO2e capacity, which again is a conversion from pounds to metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, is 5,171, and the emissions limit, which is based on average CO2e capacity and the early action credit, if present, is 112.4. Finally, we will enter emissions in pounds, and the form will auto-calculate the conversion from pounds to CO2e emissions. And from this information, we can see that for this example, CO2e emissions are less than our emissions limit, meaning we're in compliance with the regulation. Finally, on the reporting process, there are a couple of small changes to the process for submitting your completed data year 2021 reporting form. Entities subject to CARB's mandatory greenhouse gas reporting regulation must submit annual reports using CalEGRIT. In the past, you had to convert your Microsoft Excel-based reporting form to an XML file and then upload the XML file. We've now eliminated the XML conversion step, meaning you can directly upload your completed spreadsheet to CalEGRIT, generate the report, and certify. Like last year, CalEGRIT has built-in data validation checks that will flag potential issues. Some of the flags may prevent report submission if the issue is not corrected. Hence, we recommend allocating sufficient time to work with this feature prior to the June 1st deadline. These checks are in place to help you identify potential errors prior to submission and to ensure more accurate data reporting overall. Reporting entities not subject to the mandatory greenhouse gas reporting regulation are still encouraged to report via CalEGRIT, but they may also email or mail the completed reporting form and assigned attestation statement to CARB staff. Our email address is energy@arb.ca.gov, and electronic submission is highly encouraged. You can find our mailing address on our annual reporting webpage. So that wraps up the data year 2021 reporting section of the presentation. We'll now discuss new requirements taking effect in 2022. This slide provides a high-level summary of some of the revised concepts you'll see in the amended regulation. In recognition of emerging technologies, we've broadened the scope of gases covered. The original regulation only required tracking and reporting of SF6, whereas the amended regulation applies to all covered insulating gases. Covered insulating gases are those with a GWP greater than 1. GWP is a metric that describes the potency of a greenhouse gas relative to carbon dioxide over an established time period. The GWP of carbon dioxide is 1, and the GWP of SF6 used in this regulation is 22,800. Some values must be reported in units of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Equations throughout the regulation explain how to convert values measured in pounds to this unit of measure. Some of the gases that could be used in place of SF6 are actually blends of multiple gases. Only the constituent members of gas blends that are covered insulating gases are to be reported, starting in data year 2022. For example, if you emit 100 pounds of a gas blend that is 5% Novec 4710, whose GWP is 2,000, 20% carbon dioxide, whose GWP is 1, and 75% oxygen, whose GWP is 0, you would only report the 5 pounds of Novec 4710 because the other gases are not covered insulating gases. Section 95354M lists the equation to use when calculating the amount of covered insulating gas in a blend. We've also changed the term used to describe the electrical equipment covered by this regulation to gas-insulated equipment, or GIE, instead of gas-insulated switchgear. This change does not affect the type of equipment covered. It just clarifies that switchgear are not the only electrical equipment covered. The definition of GIE included in section 95351A includes all equipment that provide insulating and/or interrupting functions regardless of insulating medium. The term GIE, therefore, includes, for example, equipment that use SF6, alternative gases, vacuum, and solid dielectric mediums. While these are all considered GIE, per section 95354A, only those GIE that use covered insulating gas are required to be reported starting in data year 2022. Every GIE device has a capacity, which is the amount of covered insulating gas that it is designed to contain while operating. Under the original regulation, the capacity of each device was established by the manufacturer, typically on the nameplate. CARB staff heard from stakeholders that the capacity specified on manufacturer nameplates may be inaccurate. Therefore, under the amended regulation, the capacity of GIE acquired and activated after December 31st of 2021 will be determined using a new method, so-called covered insulating gas at activation, or CIGA. CIGA is calculated by summing the amount of gas added to a device during the activation process and the amount inside the device when it was acquired. The amount of gas added to the device at activation is to be recorded pursuant to section 95354 A10A3B and must be determined using one of the methodologies specified in section 95354B1 or B2. The amount of gas in the device when acquired must be recorded pursuant to section 95354A10A2, and this value may be determined either from information provided by the manufacturer or by transferring covered insulating gas from the GIE device to a gas container and measuring the amount of covered insulating gas transferred. Regardless of who performs the measurement, the GIE owner is responsible for ensuring the gas is accounted for consistent with one of the methodologies specified in section 95354B1, B2, D1, or D2. For all GIE for which SIGA is not required to be calculated, for example, those acquired prior to January 1st of 2022, SIGA will equal the manufacturer's nameplate capacity. So while using SIGA will make the capacity of GIE acquired and activated after December 31st of 2021 more accurate, nameplate capacity will be used for all other existing GIE. Therefore, a separate optional nameplate capacity adjustment process has been added to the regulation that can be used to establish more accurate capacity values. GIE owners may begin this optional process at any time. The first step is to notify CARB of the intention to perform nameplate capacity adjustments, which includes a list of GIE devices that the owner will put through the process. The required components of the notification are listed in section 95357.2A1 and are included on our web page. Once a GIE owner has notified CARB they intend to perform nameplate capacity adjustments, they must follow the process described in section 95357.2C for each GIE device listed in the notification. In the third step, for each GIE device that has undergone the process and will remain in active service, and for which the revised nameplate capacity differs from the original nameplate capacity, the GIE owner must affix a capacity label to the device that meets the requirements of section 95357.2D. The label must be affixed by the end of the calendar year in which the process was completed and not obscure the manufacturer's label. Finally, GIE owners are to begin reporting the adjusted capacity value starting in the data year the measurement was performed. So for example, if the measurement was performed April 1st of 2022, the new value would be used in the data year 2022 report filed in 2023. The new value would also be used in all subsequent reports. Once a revised capacity has been established, it may only be adjusted again if there is a change to the physical capacity of the device. For example, if a bushing was replaced that causes a change in the device's capacity. Finally, there is no time limit by which nameplate capacity adjustments must be completed. This slide presents new concepts related to gas handling for GIE being activated or removed. New section 95354B requires that for GIE being activated for the first time that require the addition of covered insulating gas, gas can only be added in the year the device first becomes active. New section 95354D specifies that previously active GIE are considered removed from regular use when covered insulating gas is extracted, which must be within 1 year of the device being inactive for 5 consecutive years, or inactive for less than 5 years but being removed from the GIE owner's inventory, or being taken out of active service for the purpose of removal from the GIE owner's inventory. When gas is added during activation, it must be measured using the method specified in section 95354B1 or B2. When gas is extracted, it must be measured using the method specified in section 95354D1 or D2. Sometimes GIE in active service are transferred from one GIE owner to another. In this case, the device is considered transferred while in use in the data year in which it changes hands. Gas extraction is not required when this occurs. On this slide, we wanted to highlight the changes we made to the emissions equation. The left-hand column contains the terms of the emissions equation, which contains 4 elements and remains largely consistent with the original regulation. The middle column provides a brief description of each element of the equation. The rightmost column contains the changes we've made in the amended regulation. The element on the first row of the table, the decrease in insulating gas inventory, tracks changes in the amount of gas in storage containers and carts throughout the year. The next 2 elements track acquisitions and disbursements of insulating gas in GIE containers and carts. The final element tracks changes in the total capacity of active GIE over the course of the year. In terms of revisions, the first element now specifies that the amount of gas stored should include containers as well as carts. For the acquisitions term, we've clarified that gas acquired in a device should be accounted for in the first year the device is made active. In the disbursements term, we have clarified the disbursement categories. In the final term, we have updated terminology to incorporate concepts previously discussed, such as SIGA. The points in time that the amount of gas stored in containers must be quantified remain largely the same as in the original regulation, but were made more specific. The amount of gas in each container owned by or stored on the property of the GIE owner is still required to be measured at the end of each calendar year and when the container is added to or removed from inventory. However, the end of the calendar year is now explicitly considered to be between December 1st of the data year and January 15th of the next data year. Also, section 95354G2 specifies that gas containers not owned by and not stored on the property of the GIE owner, which are brought on site for use at the GIE owner's facilities, must be weighed both immediately before and after use. The amount of gas within the container when it arrived must be reported as added to inventory, and the amount of gas within the container when sent away must be reported as removed from inventory. The regulation also specifies how to account for gas in gas carts. GIE owners have 3 options described in detail in sections 95354J, 2A through C. The container method has the GIE owner transfer gas from the cart to a container, then weigh the container. The mass flow meter method is similar in that gas is transferred from the cart, but the amount of gas is measured by a mass flow meter. Finally, the gas cart can be weighed using the scale method. Pursuant to section 95354J2D, GIE owners using the container or mass flow meter method must specify the pressure at which the cart is considered to be empty according to manufacturer specifications and bring the cart to that pressure for each measurement. Pursuant to section 95354J1, the GIE owner must select the methodology they will use to determine the amount of gas inside each cart, either by January 1st of 2022 or the date the cart is acquired. The selected methodology must be recorded, then used for all future measurements of that cart. Starting with the data year 2022 report, several new data elements will be required for each GIE device that uses covered insulating gas. These include the name and GWP of the covered insulating gas used, whether the device is jointly owned, and for those that are, the percent of the device owned by each GIE owner. For GIE acquired after December 31st, 2021, dates purchased and acquired are also to be reported. The terms acquire and purchase are defined in section 95351A. Changes in operational status must also be reported for non-hermetically sealed GIE. Section 95354A10A7 lists the status changes that must be reported, including activation for the first time, transfer while in use, and removal from regular use. Also, for non-hermetically sealed GIE only, the number of days each device was active GIE, as defined in section 95351A, during the data year must be reported. So must an indication of whether the device was active on January 1st and December 31st of the year, and for those not active on December 31st, the last date it was active. Finally, for GIE acquired after December 31st of 2021, GIE owners will need to report the short circuit current rating and whether the device is used above or below ground. Here we've listed a number of other requirements GIE owners should be aware of. First, section 95354K requires GIE owners to establish and adhere to written procedures to track gas containers. Per section 95354E, scales used to measure weights must be certified by the manufacturer to be accurate to within 1% of the true weight. Flow meters, temperature and pressure gauges, and gas carts must meet the accuracy requirements in section 95354F. Scales, flow meters, and temperature and pressure gauges must be calibrated and recalibrated at the time intervals specified in section 95354L, and these actions must be logged pursuant to section 95354L5. Finally, all records required to be retained pursuant to section 95356 must be kept for a minimum of 5 years, with the exception of those generated prior to January 1st of 2022, which are required to be retained for a minimum of 3 years, as was the case in the original regulation. Okay, so we have now reached the end of the presentation, and we'll shift over to the questions and answers portion of the webinar. As a reminder, to ask a question, click on the raise hand icon on the GoToWebinar toolbar on your screen. Carrie will call on audience members whose hands are raised. Once you are called upon, you will need to unmute yourself by clicking on the red microphone icon. Carrie, do we have any hands raised yet?
Thanks, Brian. Hi, everybody. This is Carrie Bylan with CARB. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. And I am just taking a look to see if there are any hands raised. Please bear with me. Okay, there is Raul Ramirez. I am going to unmute you. You need to unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Hello. Can you please remind me again why equipment purchased or activated before January 2021 do not qualify for the early credit?
Thank you. This is Carrie, and I'll answer that. What I would like to do is direct you to our rulemaking record where we explain the rationale for the various elements that we have put into the amended regulation. So if you would like to follow up after the webinar, we can direct you to where that is covered in that information.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, and just so everybody is aware, I will be lowering your hand after you speak. So if you do end up having another question, you can raise your hand again. So next is Cindy Parsons. Let's see, I think I have unmuted you and you can ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So my question has to do with slide 17, I believe, where it said that that the gas has to be added to the GIE in the same year that it becomes active. And there's a couple of situations that don't really fit in that parameter. So one is where the gas is added to the GIE in December, but it's not fully connected to the grid, which per the definition of active until January or February of the following year. And then there's also another situation where for critical substations that they have on-site spares, and they will typically fill the spare with gas, but they will not connect it to the grid because it is a spare. But the reason they fill it with gas ahead of time is so that if they do have a failure, that they can activate the spare quickly. But until it's needed, it just sits there full of gas, but not connected to the grid. So can you explain how we deal with those two situations?
Hey, Cindy, yeah, thanks for your question. This might be something that we would need to discuss after today's webinar. As you mentioned, there are requirements that say gas should not be added to equipment in a year prior to the year in which the device is activated for the first time. So if you can follow up with us on that one, we'll try to get you a response later.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Next, I will go to Jerry Brown. I have unmuted you and you can ask your question.
Good morning, everyone. Jerry Brown with Pacific Gas and Electric. This question kind of dovetails well with the previous one. We have Evolution Sub, which is our training facility that is not connected to the grid, has a number of assets there that have been filled with gas, but they are idle. And I need clarification on how to address those.
So
Okay.
is that a similar question to the one we just got from Cindy?
Yeah, I think that I think that it's the same. Yes, or similar,
Okay.
anyways. They will never be put. They will never be energized, whereas the spares will, for what it's worth.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
It
I'm making
sounds.
a note about that too.
Oh, sorry, Brian.
Oh, go ahead, Kieran.
Yes. Okay, so we've noted these. It sounds like these are some specific circumstances that we can answer at a later time. So please do follow up with us after this webinar. Okay, next is Brian Story. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Hey, first of all, thank you for putting on this webinar. It's very much appreciated, all the extra information. It's essentially the same question as Cindy and Jerry. We have clients that have GIE that are filled but are in storage as spares. They don't fit the definition of active, and yet gas contained in containers or carts, it specifically omits GIE from that. So it's really just a matter of how to account for that gas for that spare GIE inventory. And again, that's we'll like you said, we'll have to follow up at a later date, but it sounds like it's a pretty prevalent question out there at this time. I know there's some other clients that have the same question, and so it may warrant maybe another webinar or just a group conference call.
Okay, great. It sounds like we will handle that after the fact, unless Brian, do you have anything to add at this point? Sorry, Brian Cook.
Yes.
No, not at this point.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you for the question. Next, we have Collins Kalu. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. And we cannot hear you, so if you are able to unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, looks like they have dropped off, so we can certainly come back to you if needed. Next would be Kristen Cooley. I have unmuted you, and you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, good morning, and also thank you for taking the time out to make this presentation. So I had a question on phase-out equipment for SF6 gas. Is there currently science/technology to replace SF6 gas for KVs that are 220 or higher, 245 kV? Is there any existing technology as a replacement?
So I'll take a first stab at answering this, and Brian, you can jump in if needed, but we have in our rulemaking materials, we had listed the information that was available to us, publicly available and provided to us by manufacturers about either existing non-SF6 gas insulated equipment that is currently available, as well as manufacturers' plans for making available non-SF6 gas insulated equipment in the future. So we provided that information in our rulemaking materials. We can certainly point you directly to where that is. Again, that was a point in time, so it might have been updated since then, but that would be a start to answering your question about the availability. And I will note that we didn't provide it in here, but the phase out takes place over time, and it takes place over time according to the different voltage levels. And we had established those differing dates based on the information that we had regarding the future planned availability of non-SF6 gas insulated equipment at those voltage levels from at least 2 manufacturers, plus a period of time to allow for testing by GIE owners. So we can direct you to that more detailed information, again, in the regulation and in the rulemaking record, if that would be helpful.
That would be very helpful. I'm trying to put an analysis together for our company to present to engineering operations to see what our future steps are to be compliant in the phase-out process.
Okay, great. So we will connect with you on that after the webinar.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, it looks like Collins Kalu is back. I'm going to go back and see if you're able to ask your question. It looks like you're already unmuted if you want to ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much. Now, I just want to know, can we get a copy of this presentation just to review later on? Is there any way you can send us a copy of this presentation?
The presentation is available on our website, which is shown on this slide right here.
Okay.
And you're seeing a direction to it. So this is our website, and you would go to meetings and workshops along the left-hand page there. And then today's meeting is noticed there, and the staff presentation is available for download currently. That's the presentation that you just saw. And we are also recording this webinar so that when that recording is available, that will also be posted in the same place so that you can see the entire webinar as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Tim Sisk. Tim, if you would like to, it looks like you're already unmuted. You can ask your question.
Yeah, good morning. So I believe the regulation is silent on this. And so just looking for a little clarification. hermetically sealed GIE. Fully understand definition that it's factory sealed for life. However, I was made aware of some instances with a colleague, another company, where there was a failure of a hermetically sealed GIE. So what would there be, if any, not documentation, but reporting or notification to CARB that would be required, or is just the regulation silent on this?
Tim, so with regard to emissions from a hermetically sealed device, I'd direct you to look at the emissions equation that we have in the regulation, which covers, acquisitions, disbursement of gas, and also changes in the capacity of active equipment. And active equipment are defined such that hermetically sealed GIE do not qualify. So if you follow the emissions equation, I think you'll find that the emissions from a hermetically sealed device actually don't count toward your annual emissions total. And there's no requirement to notify CARB of a release from such an event.
Okay, that was my interpretation as well. Appreciate that clarification, Brian.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Ralph McCaffrey. You are unmuted and should be able to ask your question. Actually, let me see. Maybe you're not. Okay, now you can unmute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. I heard something, and I want to make sure I heard it correctly regarding SIGA. If we buy equipment that comes filled to capacity already from the manufacturer, basically a distribution switch, for example, can we use the nameplate as the SIGA, or do we have to evacuate that device and weigh it and fill it again to get SIGA after January 1st, 2022?
Yeah, so I'm trying to find the specific language in the regulation about covered insulating gas at activation. So what this says in section 95354A10A2 is that for GIE acquired after December 31st, 2021, the amount of covered insulating gas in a device at the time it was acquired must be recorded. That information can either be provided by the manufacturer or can be measured by taking the gas out of the device, weighing the gas, and putting it back in. So you, in addition to measuring it yourself, you could also get the information from the manufacturer, and each GIE owner is responsible for making sure that whatever value is used is measured consistent with one of the methodologies in the regulation, regardless of who performs the measurement.
Okay. I think I can live with that.
Okay, thank you. Please do follow up if you have any questions that come up on that issue. Same goes to everyone, whether you've asked a question or not. We are available for follow-up questions at any time. Okay, next we will go to Cameron Toy. You should be unmuted on our end. You can unmute and ask your question.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, so I have a question regarding the gas cart requirements in the amended regulation, which requires accounting for the volume of the covered insulated gas in the cart using either the container method or the scale method. So my question is, if we bring in an equipment manufacturer on site to help with a repair, who owns the gas cart, who is responsible for measuring the volume of the covered insulated gas in the cart? Is it us as the GIE owner, or is it the gas cart owner?
So for this provision, the requirement for any storage container brought on site, be it a container or a cart, is just that the amount of gas be determined both immediately before and after use at your facilities. The regulation doesn't specify which party is required to make that measurement.
Okay, it seems like the regulation's specific on determining which method you're going to use and only using that method going forward. So is the person responsible the GIE owner for ensuring that, or is it the gas cart owner for ensuring that?
So that requirement to select a method is specific to gas carts that are owned by or stored on the property of the GIE owner. So if the cart was owned by a third party, then there's more flexibility there.
Okay.
And if you have any follow-up questions on this, feel free to follow up after the fact too.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Linus Farias. Linus, you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Great, thanks, Carrie. And thank you for the presentation, very useful. I have a couple of questions. First one has to do with nameplate capacity adjustments. So is there a template or a format that CARB has put together for the notifications? Or is that how is that being handled? Or is that just something we report right as part of our report?
So we actually just published a new web page that explains how to submit the notification. Maybe we can pull that up here. Yeah, so from our homepage on the left-hand side, there's a link that says notification processes. And then this gives a summary of how to submit the notification to CARB.
Okay, great. All right, that helps. Thank you. And as we go through the nameplate adjustments, depending on the devices that are being worked on, there could be numerous events that occur during the year. So is the expectation that we'd be submitting these for each event or each GIE, or what's the what it would work there?
Yeah, so the nameplate capacity adjustments will be kind of rolled up into your annual report. There are some reporting requirements under the nameplate capacity section that explain the additional data that must be reported for each device whose capacity was adjusted during the year. Since those adjustments could not begin until 2022, you'll see that in the new reporting form that we put together for data year 2022 that would be submitted in 2023. But it's also explained in the regulation as well. And
Okay.
if you would like to follow up with me on that, I can find you the exact citations.
Okay. No, thanks, Brian. And then my second question actually has to do with the early action credit. Is that going to be reported on every year on a 10% off total capacity basis? Will that number be reset every year?
It's going to be cumulative. So each year you will report all of the equipment that received early action credit, and then the reporting form will automatically calculate how much credit you've accrued. So if the first year you have a certain set, the second year you would report those same equipment again, and then any new equipment that came online during that year.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Sure.
And maybe I'll just add on the nameplate capacity adjustment process. The idea is that the notification of the plan to follow that voluntary process would occur once. That is what is specified in the regulation. So if you have follow-up questions on that, just let us know.
Okay, yeah, probably we'll have some follow-up questions because sometimes the work is not necessarily predictable, where it could be a one-time notification for all activities. But we'll follow up on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, next we will go to Daniel Addo. You are unmuted and should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Awesome. Kerry, thank you. My question is probably related to some of the questions that's been previously asked already. But this is the situation. You have a spare GIE equipment that is being shipped, received from the manufacturer before last year, 31st December, and you've been reporting, and then you've been told that you should report it as it is because with the nameplate capacity instead of what was filled in before it was shipped from the manufacturer, which was bare minimum, right? Something a little bit like less than 2 pounds or something like that. And we reported with the nameplate capacity. So how do we proceed with this new regulation being implemented now?
Yeah, so it sounds like you have a piece of equipment that was acquired sometime in 2021 or earlier.
No, before, way before, and we've been reporting. But when we were told, I was told basically by personnel from CARB that I should just report it with the nameplate capacity. All right, but it was barely empty, and that's how I've been reporting it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a spare. So with the new regulations, how do we handle that? Do we just continue to report as it is?
Yeah, that's right. You would continue to report it as is with the nameplate capacity since it's an older piece of equipment. Should your company choose to perform nameplate capacity adjustments, which is an option that you have under the regulation, you could remeasure what the capacity should be. And if you choose to do that, then you can use the measured value from that point forward.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
Okay, next we have Betty Chu. You are unmuted on our end. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Do you have guidance on how to properly retire an SF breaker? Because we want to avoid those ghost emissions because the nameplate is definitely not the same as the gas that we recovered.
Hey, Betty, we don't have any specific guidance on how to retire equipment, but this might be a situation where nameplate capacity adjustments could help. We have heard from stakeholders that sometimes the capacity of equipment that's listed on the nameplate isn't accurate, and therefore when the device is retired, if the actual capacity of the device was lower than the nameplate, the emissions equation makes it look like there were emissions to the atmosphere that didn't occur. But if your company chooses to take advantage of this optional provision, you could measure what the capacity of that device should have been, and then you can use that measured value instead of the nameplate capacity when you retire it and calculate your emissions. And that way, if the nameplate capacity was too high, you'll calculate a measured value that's more in line with the amount of gas that you take out, and that should solve this issue of over-reporting emissions that didn't actually occur.
And maybe I'll just add one comment on that as well, that our regulation specifies that the nameplate is based on the nameplate affixed to the device by the manufacturer or in manufacturer specifications. So as with the original regulation, it has been retained in the amended regulation that if the manufacturer is able to provide revised specifications for a device, that it can also be used to address issues with inaccuracies of the original nameplate capacity designation.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, great, thank you. Next, we'll go to Raul Martinez. You should be unmuted on our end. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, good morning. This is Raul Martinez from IID. My question was about the new regulation moving towards total emissions and away from the emissions rate. Is there any idea of what, if there will be the emissions rate had yearly decrease requirements, I guess, up until 2020. Are we going to be looking at the same requirements with the total emissions? Sort of a limit? Oh, I'm sorry if this was covered already.
Hi, Raul. Yeah, so the new emissions limit under the amended regulation is a little different than the old emission rate limit that we had under the original regulation. Under the new regulation, every GIE owner's emission limit will be essentially 1% of their system capacity if their system capacity is greater than or equal to 10,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So for those GIE owners, and we have the equation up here on the slide, the new emissions limit should be about the same as the old emission rate limit was in terms of how much SF6 can be emitted. This new equation also integrates the early action credit. So the emissions limit would be a little bit higher for companies that choose to take advantage of that provision. And I think that the main change we have here is that for companies or other GIE owners with a system capacity less than 10,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, their emissions limit is now either 2% of their capacity or 50 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, whichever of those is greater. So the emissions limit for those smaller regulated entities is more consistent with what it was like in the year 2019 and prior. But for the larger entities, the emissions limit should be about the same. It's still about 1%. Does that help?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And it looks like Brian Story, you have your hand up. I'm gonna unmute you. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. It's more of a comment, and this kind of tails on to Daniel's situation regarding the spare GIE. Again, the so it may be reported, however, being a spare GIE, that it's labeled as inactive. So in terms of the nameplate multiplied by the days of active service, you essentially get a 0 on that. And since it's not considered a container or cart, or specifically takes out the GIE, any gas in spare GIE, that also kind of leads into the question of, how is that specifically accounted for? Because in the annual emissions equation, it's based on active GIE, and not spare or inactive GIE. So really more of just a comment to tack on to Daniel's comment.
Sure, thanks for that, Brian. So I'll try to maybe take a step back and explain what needs to be reported and how emissions are accounted for in these situations. So if you acquire a piece of equipment and it is yet to be activated, it's a spare, you do need to report it as a line item in your annual report. We have a tab of the reporting form that's for gas insulated equipment. There you would report it, put it, the serial number on there and its nameplate capacity, among other details, as you see here on the screen. Now, until that device is activated, it's not going to enter your emissions equation at all. The emissions equation, as you mentioned, is specific to active equipment. So what happens is in the data year in which that device is activated for the first time, you would report both the amount of gas it had inside of it when it was acquired and the capacity or SIGA of the device. So essentially, from an emissions accounting perspective, it's like you don't even have the spare device until the first year it is activated. And then all of the gas is accounted for in that same year, regardless of which year the gas was actually acquired and how long it's been sitting around. It's all accounted for in the year it was activated.
Right. So essentially, if you have a spare GIE, and let's just say it's filled completely to manufacturer nameplate capacity and sitting in storage, but not active, that volume of gas essentially, or mass of gas, doesn't get accounted for until such time as it becomes activated.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, thanks everyone for the questions. I don't see any more. So maybe I'll just do a final call for any questions or comments you have. Please indicate that by raising your hand. Okay, looks like we have another hand raised. Ashwin Dege, sorry about if I mispronounced, but you are unmuted and can ask your question.
Hi, thank you for holding all of this, as previous speakers have said. I actually was just going to follow up on a comment you made earlier, given the common theme with many of these questions. Would it be possible for you to, once you go back and get some of those answers, to provide maybe a quick fax or an updated bulletin on the website with the most common ones? I know you mentioned taking a lot of those comments offline with particular users, but I think given how common they are, it would be helpful for all of us if we could see those answers.
Thank you for that comment, and that makes sense. We do have, we have a historically kept and frequently asked questions document on our website for that exact purpose. We are in the process of updating that in accordance with the revised reporting regulations. So we will take this into account, the fact that this is a common question that has come up on this webinar. So again, we do not have, sure, thank you. We don't have that up yet, but we will be planning to update and post that soon.
Perfect, much appreciated.
Okay, once again, I'm not seeing anyone with their hand raised. So if there are any other comments or questions, please let us know by using the raise hand feature. Okay, I don't see any other raised hands. So with that, I believe we can close the webinar. So again, thank you very much to everybody for participating this morning. As was mentioned, the presentation is available currently on our website, and we will also, get a recording of this session and post that as soon as we have that available to us. So thank you very much for your participation. Please do follow up with us if you to discuss the questions that came up today or anything else that comes up. And otherwise, thank you very much and have a great day.